Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're back with me for another evening of studying logic and legal reasoning. If I remember correctly, the last time I left you with a little bit of a cliffhanger, and so I'd like to begin today's shorter lecture by returning to that material and resolving this problem for you, hopefully satisfactorily. Sharing my screen now. All right, hopefully you can now see Ohio's arson statute. Presentation did not want to go into full screen today. So what was the puzzle we were considering? Well, I described that there were 4 different types of sentences, but only one sentence type could function as a premise in an argument. What was that sentence type? Well, it was the assertoric or declarative sentence. Other kinds of sentences, such as imperatives, interrogatives, and exclamatory sentences, were inapt to function as premises in an argument. Only the assertoric or declarative sentence could function as a premise in an argument. But wait, when we consider this Ohio arson statute, to me, it looks like it has the form of an imperative. It's saying, don't do that. It says, no person shall do any of the following. It looks much like the 10 Commandments, doesn't it? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. According to the Ohio legislature, thou shalt not commit arson. And so how are we to have legal reasoning, at least about the criminal law, when the law itself looks like it has an imperative form? Well, I'd like for you to consider a statute from another state. This is the arson statute from Virginia, where I'm from, and it reads as follows. It's quite a long statute, so I'm going to skip just a bit of it. It says, if any person maliciously burns or by use of any explosive device or substance destroys the dwelling, house, or manufactured home of another, then he shall be guilty, reading down in the blue, of a felony, punishable by imprisonment for life or for any period not less than 5 years. Now, to me, the term shall might generate a little bit of funny business here, because shall can have this imperative form, but it can also mean something like will. He will be guilty of a felony. Now, as I'm reading this Virginia statute, to me, it looks like this sentence is a declarative sentence. If a person does these things, he will be guilty of a felony. It looks very much declarative, and it looks like the kind of thing that is acceptable for use in an argument. It has the right kind of grammatical form. And so what we might say to resolve the puzzle about how logical reasoning, logic and legal reasoning could be possible is that for any law that reads as an imperative, we understand that there is a kind of declarative translation, right? There's a declarative translation. The Ohio statute says no person shall do these things. The Virginia statute says if you do these things, it will be a crime or it will be a felony. So for any sort of imperative law, there's probably a declarative corollary. And when we appeal to this declarative corollary, it seems to me that logical reasoning should be perfectly acceptable when we use the law as a premise. So I think this will actually solve the problem we were considering in the last class. Maybe you feel a bit better. We can all rest easy now, right? Now, I'm at a little bit of a loss here because this piece that I assigned from Waldron is very usually the thing that generates lively class discussion. I like to come to class and quiz the class on various aspects of the reading. We have a nice discussion about it, and then before I know it, an hour and a half has passed and we're all on our way. As I'm just sitting here talking to a computer, things are a bit more awkward. And so there are some things that I think are interesting to think about. But beyond me just telling you what the reading says, I don't really see what the purpose of this lecture would be. This lecture does assume that you've done the reading already. So if you haven't already, just pause the video and complete that. We're here for our purposes today. I'd like to basically highlight 2 aspects of the reading that I personally find interesting and which will lay kind of a nice foundation for what we're going to do in the rest of the class. In the next module of the class, recall that we'll be studying a bit of the law that I've called Finder's Law. In Finder's Law, we're going to be trying to figure out who has better title to things that are found. Of course, you've walked along the street before and found maybe a $20 bill or something like that. And if the true owner doesn't come along and sort of claim that money, who will acquire title to it? Well, intuitively, we have this saying in the English language, finders keepers. And to say that the finder gets to keep the thing that was found is not to say, of course, that they have always the best possible title to that property, because it seems like the true owner could always come along and assert a superior claim to that thing. But we are saying that the finder does have some kind of rights to that thing that's found. And so the cases that we'll look at in the coming weeks deal with that issue of the law. For here, though, we'll begin to think a little bit about the foundations for that kind of thinking, the justifications that might be offered for preferring one kind of result to another. And for that, I think it's good to put our hats on and think about the philosophical issues associated with property law. So as I can see it from the reading, there are two primarily interesting topics that will be the subject of this very short video today. They pertain to the categories of property that exist and the justifications that we can have, probably not for a system of property, but for an initial distribution of property. I'll say it right up front here. An initial distribution of property relates to the allocation of resources that are derived from nature, right? If you've done the reading, you'll note that what an initial distribution is relates to humans confronted with a vast world full of natural resources. At one time, probably before we were all born, the world was full of many natural resources like berries and firewood and charcoal and whatnot. And somehow individuals had to make these natural resources practicable. And so they went out into nature and they harvested various natural resources, didn't they? And ultimately, somewhere in the fray, property rights arose. Can you imagine that? There's just man and these natural resources, and somewhere property rights arose from that mess. And so the question about the initial distribution relates to how property rights arose from the state of nature, doesn't it? We'll talk about that in a moment. For now, though, to begin, we'll talk about the three types of property that Waldron categorized. He talked about common property, collective property, and private property. It's incredibly difficult to draw a nice line between common and collective property. The more I've thought about it, the more I've realized that it's just a very difficult task. Common property is supposed to be the kind of property which is owned by no one and which could be used for a great number of different purposes. But it's difficult to actually say what a piece of common property might look like. I'm not aware of any such property in my environment, at least. I thought for starters that maybe a park, something like Goodale Park, would be an example of common property. Why? Because, well, at least Goodale Park isn't owned by anyone. It might be owned by the state of Ohio or the city of Columbus, but it's not owned by anyone in particular, is it? And you can use Goodale Park for a great number of activities like rollerblading and playing tennis and jogging, maybe even a little bit of street hockey on the tennis courts if you're brave. But I mean, at the end of the day, it looks like Goodale Park has this general purpose defined as recreation. You couldn't just go to Goodale Park and plant some corn, could you? I don't think so. So it has some restrictions on its use. The restrictions, like the text says, are related to securing enjoyment of the property by anyone, but at the same time, the purposes for which one could use Goodale Park do look pretty well defined. But in much the same way, collective property is also owned by no one, and yet it has a very particular purpose for which it's intended to be used. I'll use for illustration here University Hall, where my office is located. I take it University Hall is supposed to be generally used for education, but Goodale Park, you might recall, is supposed to be used generally for recreation. So how do we draw a line between these two things? It's very difficult. We just have to put on our hats, I guess, and accept whatever characterization Waldron has given us. So don't think too hard about it, I guess. But University Hall is supposed to be collective because it's owned by no one, and yet it has a more restricted purpose than, say, a park. You must, whatever you do in University Hall, it seems like if you're going to be using University Hall for anything, it's got to be rationally related in some way to education, doesn't it? Whereas you could probably do a great number of things in, common property like Goodale Park. Other examples of collective property where the purposes are pretty narrowly defined include probably the state capitol of Ohio. It's owned by no one, and yet it looks like the activity that goes on in that building must be rationally related to legislation of some kind, right? So these are supposed to be examples of collective property owned by no one. But in the case of collective property, it looks like it has a very narrow scope on the restrictions associated with its use, whereas common property has relatively fewer, I suppose, restrictions on what one could do in the common property, although where exactly to draw the line is not quite clear to me. What is clear to me is that there is this third category of property, which is called private property. And this is owned by an individual or a group of individuals, I suppose. And with private property, you have a maximally defined set of rights that you enjoy toward this property. You can give it away. You can devise it to your kids. You can put it in your will and convey it to them such that when you die, the intended party that you designate will receive the same bundle of rights that you had in that property. Isn't that something? For illustration, I've chosen here these Topper Monster Makers because it was something that my dad collected when I was growing up. He definitely had a collection of private property here. He had a collection of these Monster Makers. He could do whatever he wanted with him. And I asked that when he died, that he would leave me this guy right here, a Galaxian. Well, of course, now I'm like 30 years old and I no longer care about these toys, but he still keeps it in his closet for me because he wants to give it to me when he dies. I think it's funny. He has the rights of divisibility in these properties. Note that, by the way, there is no right of divisibility in either common or collective property. One couldn't leave it to somebody else in a will, for instance. It's just to be continued. Its use would continue, I guess. There's no person that could die and could then, leave it to somebody else in a will, right? There's no right of divisibility associated with the other kinds of property, whereas in the case of private property, it looks like you can leave this in a will to somebody else. You can also get rid of it if you want. You can abandon it, you can give it away, you can sell it. All these rights are yours when you are the owner of private property. Now, I think that we can use these categorizations of property to offer something of a rough characterization of a difference between socialist economies and capitalist economies. This will only be along one dimension of economic appraisal, of course, but you might think that in a socialist economy, relatively more of the assets of economic significance are going to be collective properties. They're going to be, in a sense, owned by no one. Whereas in a capitalist society, relatively fewer of these assets of economic significance are going to be owned by no one. They'll have more definite owners, more readily identifiable owners in a capitalist society. And again, there doesn't seem to be a particular threshold at which a society becomes capitalist or socialist. You only get the comparative claim that in a socialist society, more assets of economic significance, such as utilities and other means of production, those will be owned by no one in particular, right? So you have some resources if you appeal to this categorization of property and you accept these definitions of common, collective, and private property. It might go some way in helping you to explain the difference between different economic structures, right? Now we'll move on to something that I consider to be just a bit more interesting. needs for justification that arise for particular systems of private property. Now, one downstream consequence of private property and the systems with it are that there seem to be, in every society of which I'm aware, somebody who just does very well. They have a lot of assets at their disposal. They enjoy more rights. They have a lot of property. They're rich, or at least they have a lot more freedom. They can do a lot more with their lives. And then there seem to be the people that are languishing under such a society. They have relatively fewer assets. But in any case, most people that I've heard of throughout history have owned at least something that could not have been taken away from them. Even the poorest of the people that I've seen in this country usually have some kind of private property that they carry along with them, don't they? That's interesting. Now, I'd like to focus on this second question that arises, one related to the justification of an initial distribution. Well, I've already told you in this lecture that the initial distribution is a question about how natural resources properly become the private property of individuals. After all there were these natural resources and these people, and somewhere in the mix, private property resulted from that weird juxtaposition of things, right? How did this happen, and what makes it permissible that it happened and continues on in perpetuity? We'll consider this question now, and I think that there are primarily three views for our consideration that we'll consider. The first of these comes from David Hume. David Hume's picture of the initial distribution is that it isn't really a question of fairness per se. What happened in the initial distribution is that greedy and cunning human beings went out to the state of nature, and they greedily adapted everything they could to their purposes. They cut down trees, they panned for gold, they derived minerals from the soil and whatnot. And after the dust settled, and after their arms are full of these natural resources, they looked about and they noticed that they actually weren't the strongest party on the earth. There were other people who were vastly superior with respect to their physical strength, who could quickly come along and dispossess them of what they had worked so hard to get. And so out of these fears about loss arose these needs for security. And how were those desires satisfied? Well, they were satisfied through informal agreements. Parties came to one another and they just agreed, hey, I won't mess with your stuff if you won't mess with mine. Okay, deal. And then out of that, if a third party were to mess with our stuff, would you help me get my stuff back? Well, yeah, of course. And through informal agreements of that kind and fears of loss, arose these systems of private property in which there are quite strong mechanisms for enforcing these expectations that we've come to have toward the materials we've collected, right? Of course, some odd results might have resulted from that. If one was sufficiently strong, it might not just be the natural resources that one could come to own, but also other people. I'll set these questions aside, but they are sort of interesting questions. Now, David Hume, he doesn't purport to say that this distribution is inherently just or anything. He's just giving an empirical description of how the system of private property came about. It almost seems like a causal explanation more than a justification. So you might think about that. In any case, the need for justification, Rousseau tries to meet it, right? His theory about why there's private property carries along with it this normative claim that tries to tell us why having a system of private property would be a good thing. His answer about how private property could be a good thing, how it could be morally permissible, involves this mutual assent among all members of society, right? There's some sort of collective, putatively, that sanctioned and blessed this initial distribution. And so, putatively, the distribution was just because it was born out of the will of the people, right? Now, of course, you might push back against this theory and think, just because the initial distribution was just doesn't mean that distributions that have succeeded from the initial distribution would be themselves just. And you might be right in thinking that. There are many worries associated with this Rousseauian theory, but his idea, at least, is that the initial distribution is justified because it arose from the will of the people. Yes. I think the third theory for our consideration, one that seems most plausible to me, is this idea proposed by John Locke. His idea is that there's something special about intermingling one's labor with natural resources. When you go out into the world, by the way, he thinks that God made and imbued with enough natural resources for everyone. When you go out into that kind of a world and you use your effort to extricate yourself from the position of poverty into which you were born, there's something good about that. And from the results of your labor, just you intermingling your labor with the natural resources, this is sufficient to give rise to property rights in some cases. So when I go and I cut down a tree, and I spend a lot of time with that tree, and I turn it into wood planks that I can use to build a house, somewhere between me cutting down the tree and the fashioning of these planks, I've intermingled my labor with the natural resource sufficient for it to become my property. Now, it is a little bit mysterious as to how and when the property rights arise, but something is added to the story now, which I think is quite interesting, and that is that the intermingling of labor with these natural resources gives rise to these property rights. Now, of course, this theory in the text also comes under criticism. It's criticized on the grounds that it's not plausible that there would be property rights before any system of property to enforce those rights. So let's think about that for just a moment here. If what John Locke is saying is the case, then it's possible for there to be property rights before any system was devised to enforce those rights. Now, how could that be? Well, property rights themselves just arise from the act of intermingling one's labor with the natural resource. When one does that, the property right arises then and there, doesn't it? There needn't be any formal institution for the enforcement of those rights. Now, this criticism I've just read to you attacks the theory of John Locke by saying, essentially, it isn't plausible that there could be property rights antecedent to any system for the enforcement of those rights. Now, why might this not be an altogether persuasive argument against John Locke? Well, I'd like to try to convince you this argument commits the logical fallacy of begging the question. When one begs the question, one assumes the conclusion of the argument they're trying to prove, right? In this case, the theory that's kind of contrary to the Lockean theory is that systems of private law or law in themselves create property rights. And so the criticism of the Lockean view is just the conclusion of their argument, right? They've assumed something that not only their interlocutors would not accept, but they've assumed the very conclusion of their own argument. So there's something very circular about what's going on with this criticism. I think the Lockean issues are interesting. I think that while they're still mysterious, they capture our intuitions about how property rights arise. And now you might be thinking, Donnie, these issues that you've described to us so far only pertain to the initial distribution, right? I mean, when have I gone out into nature and found some natural resources? I live quite far away from the wild outdoors, and I do all my living in the city. Well, there's an interesting question, I think, for us to consider about whether lost property, at the moment it's lost, and when the owner no longer can go back to retrieve this property, whether it becomes like the natural resource all over again. It's a question we'll consider in the coming weeks. And so with that said, I hope I've just given you a little bit of a foretaste of some of the philosophical issues we'll be considering. Now, in the next week, we have 3 cases that we'll read, and I'll make a short lecture on each case. They're very hard. My advice to you as you read these cases is to take your time, try to digest each word. If you don't know a word, look it up. and come to the office hour I have on Friday with any questions. The first case we'll read is the seminal case of Bridges versus Hawksworth. This is a case in which somebody finds a bundle of notes in the shop of a, well, we never find out what kind of shop it is, but they find a bundle of notes in a shop. The second case is called Hannah versus Peel. And in this case, a soldier finds a brooch in a privately owned home. And the third case we'll read is Goddard versus Winchell, in which somebody sees a meteorite hit a farm. And the meteorite buries itself under the soil as a result of the impact, and somebody finds it. But he's not the owner of the property onto which the meteorite fell. So all these cases involve a weird kind of conflict of claims. One party on one side of the argument owns the real estate where an item of personal property, such as my glasses or something like that, was found. And contrary to the owner of this property is another party called the finder, the one who actually found the stuff that's at the point of controversy. So all these cases have a very interesting structure. The last thing I'd like to say in this lecture is that you should be cautious in this class with use of the term private. Now, private can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts, and this is kind of interesting. Consider a privately owned building. If someone were to say the building is privately owned, what they'd mean by that is likely that a collection of a few people own the building, or the government doesn't own the building anymore, or something like that, right? If you saw a sign on a restaurant that said closed for a private event, you'd understand the word private there to mean something like, you can't access the event unless you were invited, right? And there are still further uses that we'll talk about later. Some of these relate to manifesting an intent to exclude other people. So a lot might be private if I put up a fence to exclude you. In the case of abortion, which we'll look at even later in the semester, sometimes rights to an abortion were thought to derive from rights of privacy, where privacy involved these abilities to make very personal decisions that one wouldn't want to disseminate very widely. And so privacy and private, the terms, can have all sorts of different meanings in this course. Just be careful that you don't assume that since private means one thing in one context, it would mean the same thing in another context. So constantly be thinking about the sense of the term privacy involved in the reading we're doing. So with that, I think that's all I'd like to say in this video. I hope it was short. And I hope to see some of you on Friday to ask any questions you have about the material. Thanks.